The rise of a tyrant. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. The son of Alois Hitler and Clara Polzel, his early years were marked by a strict upbringing and an environment influenced by the shifting political landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His father, a customs official with authoritarian tendencies, passed away when Hitler was only 13, a loss that left a lasting psychological imprint on the young man. His mother, Clara, was more nurturing, instilling in him a sense of artistic ambition, especially in painting. However, despite his artistic inclinations and attempts to pursue an academic path in art, Hitler failed the entrance exams to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, leading to a growing sense of disillusionment and resentment toward the establishment. It was in Vienna, during the years leading up to World War I, that Hitler was exposed to a volatile mix of anti-Semitic, nationalist, and militaristic ideologies that would shape his worldview. The city was a hotbed of political extremism, and Hitler absorbed the propaganda disseminated by right-wing pamphlets and nationalist circles. He became enamored with the idea of a dominant Aryan race and harbored deep resentment toward Jewish communities, whom he blamed for economic hardship and political instability. These early ideological influences would later evolve into the foundation of his twisted vision for Germany. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 proved to be a pivotal turning point in Hitler's life. As an Austrian citizen, he was initially denied entry into the German army, prompting him to renounce his Austrian citizenship in 1915. A year later, he was accepted into the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry and became a soldier in the German Imperial Army. The war had a profound effect on him. He viewed it not as a destructive conflict but as a noble struggle in which Germany was betrayed by internal enemies. This belief, particularly the idea of a stab in the back by Jews, socialists, and other enemies of the state, would become a cornerstone of his political ideology. After the war ended in 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles was imposed, Hitler, now a decorated veteran, was deeply embittered by Germany's defeat and the national humiliation he believed was the result of treacherous policies. It was during this period that he began seriously considering a political career and joined the fledgling German Workers' Party, an organization that would later become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party. Hitler's early political ideology was shaped by a combination of antisemitism, militarism, and a belief in a racially purified Germany. With remarkable charisma and an ability to manipulate public sentiment, he quickly rose to prominence within the party, laying the groundwork for his eventual ascent to power. By the time of Hitler's rise to leadership in the 1920s, his vision of a radically transformed Germany was already taking shape, setting the stage for the horrors that would follow. The art of manipulation and the cult of personality. Adolf Hitler's ascent to power was as much a product of ruthless political strategy as it was of his charismatic leadership. From the moment he entered the German Workers' Party in 1919 to his position as Chancellor in 1933, Hitler demonstrated an uncanny ability to manipulate both public sentiment and the party apparatus to consolidate and maintain control. One of his most effective tools was propaganda, which he wielded with masterful precision. The Nazi regime under Hitler's leadership became synonymous with mass propaganda, exploiting the emerging technologies of the early 20th century to manipulate the German populace. Through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public rallies, Hitler was able to craft an image of himself as a charismatic leader destined to restore Germany to greatness. He was portrayed as the ultimate savior of a nation in crisis, a man who promised to vanquish the enemies of the state and lead Germany back to its former glory. At the heart of Hitler's propaganda machine was a carefully constructed cult of personality. Hitler understood the power of spectacle, which he used to great effect to elevate his image above that of any ordinary politician. His oratory skills, honed over years of impassioned speeches delivered at raucous Nazi rallies, became the cornerstone of his ability to mesmerize and mobilize the German people. Hitler's speeches were not merely political addresses, they were theatrical spectacles designed to instill a sense of purpose and unity. He often delivered them in a charismatic and emotional style, alternating between calm, measured tones and explosive outbursts of anger, all while standing at the center of a stage adorned with swastikas and Nazi insignia. These performances were captured and disseminated widely through films like Triumph of the Will, 1935, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, which immortalized Hitler as a demigod-like figure towering above the masses. Despite his mastery of propaganda, Hitler's grip on power in the early years of the Nazi Party was not unchallenged. Several of his rivals within the party posed a significant threat to his authority. Chief among them was Ernst Röhm, a key figure in the Sturmabteilung, SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. Rome advocated for a more radical socialist vision that clashed with Hitler's increasingly authoritarian leadership style. Hitler, recognizing the danger Rome posed to his consolidation of power, orchestrated the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, a brutal purge that eliminated the SA leadership and solidified Hitler's control over the party and the military. The purges extended beyond Rome, with other dissenters within the Nazi Party being silenced through imprisonment or execution. Hitler also relied heavily on the Schutzstaffel, SS, originally a small personal bodyguard unit, to eliminate threats and enforce his vision of an authoritarian state. As the SS evolved under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, it became a paramilitary and intelligence organization tasked with suppressing opposition and ensuring the party's dominance. The SS was instrumental in the eventual formation of the Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the secret police and intelligence services that terrorized Germany and its enemies. Through these groups, Hitler created a system of fear and control that left little room for dissent. His willingness to use violence and coercion as tools of governance demonstrated the lengths to which he would go to maintain his grip on power. Another critical moment in Hitler's consolidation of power occurred after his appointment as Chancellor in 1933. The Reichstag fire, a controversial event in which the German parliament was set ablaze, allowed Hitler to push for the Enabling Act, which granted him dictatorial powers. This was a turning point that allowed Hitler to dismantle the Weimar Constitution and establish a totalitarian state. By the time the Second World War erupted in 1939, Hitler had fully entrenched himself as the unchallenged leader of Germany, with the Nazi Party subsumed into his will and the machinery of state firmly under his control. The seeds of his manipulation and ruthlessness, cultivated in the early days of his leadership, had matured into an apparatus of terror and oppression, setting the stage for the horrors of the Holocaust and the broader devastation of the Second World War. The genocide of the Holocaust and its consequences. The Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany, stands as one of the most horrifying atrocities of the 20th century. Adolf Hitler, as the architect of this genocide, orchestrated the final solution, a plan to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe in what he described as a necessary step toward the racial purity he envisioned for Germany. With the full force of the Nazi regime behind him, Hitler implemented policies that culminated in the establishment of extermination camps, mass shootings, and the forced deportation of millions to their deaths. The Holocaust was not simply a byproduct of wartime destruction, but a coldly calculated, ideologically driven enterprise of genocide. The machinery of death was built through a network of concentration and extermination camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Chelmno. These death camps, operated by the SS, were designed with industrial efficiency, using gas chambers and mass crematoria to process tens of thousands of victims per day. The final solution also involved mobile killing units known as the Einsatzgruppen, which carried out mass executions in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Soviet Union and Poland. These units were responsible for the murder of over 2 million civilians, including Jews, communists, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. The Holocaust was not confined to the European Jewish population. It also targeted individuals with disabilities, the Romani people, homosexuals, and political dissidents, groups deemed undesirable by Hitler's racial doctrine. Hitler's anti-Semitic ideology was deeply embedded in the core of Nazi policy. He viewed Jews not only as economic and social parasites but as existential threats to the Aryan race and the future of Germany. His vision of a racially pure nation required the complete removal of Jewish influence from society, an objective he pursued with relentless determination. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, enacted under his direction, stripped German Jews of their citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. These measures were the first steps in the broader campaign of dehumanization and extermination. As war engulfed Europe, Hitler and his regime intensified their efforts, leading to the full-scale implementation of the final solution. The consequences of the Holocaust were catastrophic, not only for the victims but for the entire world. The war left over 55 million dead, with the Jewish population of Europe decimated. The psychological and cultural scars of these atrocities continue to echo through history. In the aftermath of the war, the United Nations established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, in part as a response to the horrors of the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials, which condemned leading Nazis for their crimes against humanity, marked the first international effort to prosecute such atrocities. Yet, despite these legal and moral reckonings, the legacy of the Holocaust endures as a grim reminder of what can happen when genocidal ideologies are allowed to flourish unchecked. The aftermath of tyranny, the devastation of Europe and beyond. The consequences of Adolf Hitler's rule were catastrophic, reverberating far beyond the borders of Germany to reshape the political, economic, and social landscape of the 20th century. The scale of destruction wrought by Hitler's aggressive policies and the Second World War was unprecedented in human history. Economically, Germany was left in ruins. The war, driven by Hitler's militaristic ambitions and the doctrine of Lebensraum, living space, drained the country's resources to an extent that rendered its post-war recovery nearly impossible. Industrial cities such as Dresden and Hamburg were reduced to rubble through Allied bombing campaigns, while the rural countryside suffered from scorched earth tactics used by retreating German forces. The Nazi regime's obsession with conquest and war left the German economy in shambles by 1945, with rampant inflation, food shortages, and a collapsed infrastructure that required decades to rebuild under the division of East and West Germany. The human toll was equally devastating. The war resulted in the deaths of over 55 million people, including civilians and soldiers, across Europe and beyond. Entire populations in occupied territories were decimated by war crimes, forced labor, and mass executions. In the Soviet Union alone, an estimated 27 million people perished, with millions more displaced or living in conditions of unimaginable suffering. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, part of his broader vision to expand German territory at the expense of Slavic populations, led to the deaths of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, who were either executed or left to die in overcrowded camps. The Nazi regime's atrocities on the Eastern Front created a legacy of bitterness and trauma that would linger in the former Soviet states for generations. The political aftermath of Hitler's defeat was even more transformative. The collapse of the Nazi regime in 1945 marked the end of fascism as a viable political ideology in Europe and set the stage for the rise of liberal democracies and the eventual formation of international institutions aimed at preventing such devastation in the future. The Allied powers, recognizing the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism, prioritized dismantling the remaining vestiges of Nazism and ensuring that Germany would never again pose a threat to world peace. The division of Germany into East and West under the influence of the Soviet Union and the United States became a focal point of the Cold War, a period of geopolitical tension that dominated global affairs for the next half-century. The horrors of Hitler's regime and the devastation of the war prompted a re-evaluation of human rights and international law, with the establishment of the United Nations and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as direct responses to the atrocities committed under his leadership. The global consequences of Hitler's actions also extended to the psychological and cultural realm. The Holocaust and the broader suffering of the war became an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of humanity, prompting a reckoning with the capacity for evil within human societies. The trauma of the war and its aftermath gave rise to a new awareness of the dangers of ideological extremism, as well as a renewed commitment to fostering peace and understanding between nations. However, the scars of Hitler's tyranny were not confined to the old continent. The global spread of anti-Semitic and racist ideologies in the decades following the war, as well as the persistence of authoritarian regimes around the world, stand as stark reminders of the long shadow cast by his regime. In Germany itself, the post-war period was marked by a profound societal transformation. The Nuremberg trials, which saw the prosecution of leading Nazis for their war crimes, underscored the moral and legal responsibilities that come with power. The German people, many of whom had been complicit or indifferent to the regime's crimes, were forced to confront the realities of their nation's past. The process of coming to terms with the past became a central theme in post-war German society, as the country worked to rebuild its identity in the shadow of Hitler's legacy. While Germany now stands as a democratic and prosperous nation, the memory of the Nazi regime and the horrors it wrought remain a cautionary tale for the world. Ultimately, Hitler's reign and the Second World War reshaped the course of history, leaving behind a world changed forever by the devastation of his ambition. The political, economic, and social consequences of his actions were far-reaching, influencing not only the trajectory of Germany and Europe but the global order and the way humanity approaches the challenges of the 21st century. The devastation inflicted by Hitler's regime serves as a sobering reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked power and the enduring importance of vigilance in the face of extremism. The psychopath on the podium, Hitler's charisma and ruthlessness. Adolf Hitler's ascent to power and his ability to maintain a firm grip on the German state for over a decade were not merely a product of historical circumstances or political cunning. They were the result of a calculated and chilling fusion of personal charisma and ruthless manipulation. Hitler's leadership was marked by a paradoxical duality: his ability to inspire millions with speeches and promises of a revitalized Germany while simultaneously orchestrating the most systematic and brutal campaign of mass murder in human history. His psychological makeup, a blend of megalomania and cold-blooded pragmatism, was the key to his manipulation of both the German people and his inner circle. One of Hitler's most powerful tools in this manipulation was his ability to present himself as a figure of unwavering conviction and unyielding purpose. Through his mastery of rhetoric, he transformed himself into a symbol of hope and strength in a country grappling with economic despair and national humiliation. Hitler's speeches, often delivered from the podiums of massive Nazi rallies, were designed to captivate listeners. His oratory style combined theatrical gestures with a hypnotic monotone that built to dramatic crescendos, allowing him to evoke intense emotions while commanding absolute attention. He spoke in vivid, apocalyptic imagery, painting a picture of a world on the brink of chaos and decay, with himself as the lone savior who could restore order and purity. This sense of divine right, coupled with his unwavering confidence in his own destiny, made Hitler an object of almost religious-like devotion for his followers. Yet, beneath the veneer of charismatic leadership lay a deeply disturbing psychological reality. Hitler was a man of extreme hatred and arrogance, convinced of his own infallibility and the inherent superiority of the German race. He viewed the world in stark, binary terms, as a battle between the Aryan master race and the forces of chaos and degeneracy, embodied by the Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies of the state. This worldview fueled his willingness to sacrifice millions of lives to achieve his vision of a racially pure and dominant Germany. For Hitler, the end always justified the means, and he was unrelenting in his pursuit of political power and his ideological goals. This unyielding ruthlessness was not limited to his vision for the future. It extended to the present, as he was prepared to eliminate any threat to his authority, no matter how small. Hitler's manipulation extended to his closest allies as well, many of whom were entangled in the web of his mind. Figures like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, whom he trusted to carry out the most heinous aspects of the Nazi regime, were not free agents but rather instruments of his will. Hitler's ability to maintain control over his inner circle was as much a product of fear as it was of loyalty. Those who dared to question or challenge him often found themselves purged. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934, in which Hitler ruthlessly eliminated Ernst Röhm and other SA leaders who had become a threat to his power, was a clear demonstration of this calculated cruelty. The message was simple: dissent was not tolerated, and obedience was not only expected but enforced through the threat of death. Even as the war turned against Germany, Hitler's refusal to accept defeat or his own culpability in the unfolding disaster became a central part of his manipulation. He portrayed the Nazi defeat as the result of external treachery or the cowardice of his enemies, rather than his own failures as a leader and a statesman. This refusal to acknowledge his responsibility for the immense suffering his regime caused was a defining feature of his psyche. For Hitler, the truth of his actions and their consequences was irrelevant compared to the preservation of his mythos as a fallen savior of the German people. What made Hitler's manipulation particularly effective was his ability to exploit the hopes, fears, and vulnerabilities of those around him. He understood that the German people had suffered deeply in the aftermath of World War I and were desperate for a strong leader who could restore their national pride and economic stability. Hitler presented himself as the answer to their prayers, using his charisma to cloak the brutality of his ideology in the language of salvation. He also skillfully manipulated media and propaganda to reinforce his image, ensuring that his message was disseminated to every corner of the country. Through these techniques, Hitler was able to maintain his grip on power until the bitter end, crafting a legacy that would leave an indelible mark on history. The rise of the Nazi Party, a fusion of nationalism and extremism. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, better known as the Nazi Party, emerged from the political disillusionment of post-World War I Germany and the collapse of the Weimar Republic. Its origins can be traced to a coalition of nationalist, Völkisch, and socialist ideas, which were formed into an ideology that promised to restore Germany's shattered national pride and economic stability. The party was founded in 1919 by Anton Drexler, a former German army officer who sought to unify various right-wing groups under a single political banner. The party initially drew support from veterans, industrialists, and conservative elites who were deeply troubled by the political instability and economic turmoil of the post-war period. However, by the time Adolf Hitler joined the party in 1919, it was still in its infancy, with membership in the low hundreds and no clear political direction. Hitler quickly recognized the potential of the NSDAP as a vehicle for his vision of a racially pure Germany and a powerful, militarized state. At the time, the party's platform was relatively moderate compared to the radicalism that would later define Hitler's rule. The party's original manifesto, the 25-point program, outlined a blend of populist rhetoric, economic nationalism, and racial ideology. It called for the unification of all Germans in a single, ethnically homogeneous state, the overthrow of the Treaty of Versailles, the expropriation of large industrial enterprises, and the expansion of German territory in the East. Though the document was vague and contradictory in some aspects, it encapsulated the core tenets that would come to dominate Nazi policy in the years to come. The party's early ideological foundation was a mix of socialist and nationalist rhetoric, a deliberate strategy to appeal to both the working class and the conservative elite who had been alienated by the Weimar Republic's liberal democracy. As Hitler assumed leadership of the NSDAP in 1921, the party's ideology began to undergo a radical transformation. Under his direction, the NSDAP became a more structured and disciplined movement, with a clear focus on antisemitism, anti-capitalism, and the establishment of a totalitarian state. The party's early alliances with conservative and nationalist groups, such as the Deutschvölkische Schützentrutzbund, National German Defense League, and the German National People's Party, DNVP, allowed the Nazis to gain access to political offices and financial backing from industrialists who were desperate to curb the growing influence of the Communist Party. These alliances were crucial to the party's survival during the turbulent early years of the Weimar Republic, when political violence and mass protests were common. The NSDAP's paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, SA, was created in 1921 as a means of intimidating political opponents and ensuring the party's dominance in street-level agitation. The Beer Hall Putsch of 1923 became a turning point in the NSDAP's development, albeit not in the way Hitler had envisioned. The failed coup attempt against the Bavarian government was a disastrous miscalculation that led to Hitler's imprisonment and the temporary weakening of the party. However, it also provided a public platform for Hitler to refine his ideological message and solidify his leadership. While in prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, a book that would later become the foundational text of Nazi ideology. In it, Hitler outlined his vision for a racially pure, authoritarian state that would crush all enemies of the state and restore Germany to greatness. The book detailed his belief in the necessity of antisemitism, the expansion of German territory in the East, and the rejection of liberal democracy. It also emphasized the importance of propaganda and mass mobilization in achieving political power, concepts that would later be central to the Nazi Party's rise. By the time Hitler was released from prison in 1924, the political landscape in Germany had changed significantly. The economic crisis of the mid-1920s had subsided, and moderate governments had taken power, reducing the urgency of the NSDAP's revolutionary rhetoric. However, the party re-emerged in the late 1920s as a more sophisticated political movement, leveraging the growing disillusionment of the German people with the Weimar government. Hitler abandoned his earlier attempts at radical revolution and instead pursued a strategy of legal political engagement through elections and parliamentary coalition building. The NSDAP's membership and influence grew steadily, and by the early 1930s, the party had become the most powerful political force in Germany. The combination of economic hardship, nationalist fervor, and Hitler's charismatic leadership propelled the NSDAP to power, setting the stage for the horrors of the genocide that would later unfold. The reinforcement of power, control, suppression, and the construction of a totalitarian state. Upon becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Adolf Hitler initiated a sweeping campaign of political consolidation and ideological reinforcement that would culminate in the establishment of a totalitarian regime. His approach to governance was characterized by a ruthless dismantling of democratic institutions, the eradication of political dissent, and the subjugation of society under a rigidly controlled state apparatus. The transformation of the Weimar Republic into the Third Reich was not a gradual evolution but a radical and swift restructuring of Germany's political and social fabric, orchestrated with precision and calculated efficiency. One of Hitler's first and most decisive moves was the suppression of political opposition, particularly the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, and the Social Democratic Party, SPD, which had long been the most significant opposition to the Nazi regime. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, which destroyed the German parliament, provided the pretext for the passage of the Reichstag fire decree. This decree, signed by President Paul von Hindenburg at Hitler's urging, suspended individual and political freedoms, enabling the government to arrest and imprison political opponents at will. Within weeks, the KPD was banned, and its members were either arrested or forced into exile. The SPD, too, was crushed under the relentless pressure of the SS and SA, with thousands of its members arrested and sent to newly established concentration camps. The suspension of civil liberties ensured that no organized political counterforce could emerge to challenge Hitler's rule, paving the way for the complete eradication of democratic governance. The Enabling Act of 1933 marked the final stage in Hitler's consolidation of power. Passed by the Reichstag after a government-orchestrated campaign of violence against the KPD, which had boycotted the vote, the act granted Hitler dictatorial powers, allowing him to bypass the German constitution and pass laws without parliamentary approval. This act effectively dismantled the Weimar Constitution, transforming Germany into a one-party state governed by Hitler's will. The Reichstag became a rubber stamp institution, its members coerced into supporting the regime or expelled entirely. Hitler's political strategy was clear. The government would be led by a centralized authority, and all opposition, whether political or cultural, would be eliminated through force, imprisonment, or execution. Hitler's vision for a racially pure Germany extended beyond political control, encompassing every facet of society. The policies of Lebensraum, living space, and racial superiority underpinned the regime's expansionist ambitions and social policies. With the annexation of Austria in 1938, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and the eventual invasion of Poland in 1939, Hitler pursued a course of territorial expansion that would culminate in a devastating war that consumed Europe. Domestically, the Nazi regime sought to reshape German society through a strict hierarchy of Aryan supremacy, enforced through the Nuremberg laws and other discriminatory measures that sought to exclude Jews, Romani, homosexuals, and other undesirable groups from the fabric of the state. The systematic persecution of these groups was not immediately aimed at physical annihilation but at social exclusion and isolation, which laid the groundwork for the horrors that followed. The militarization of Nazi Germany was another cornerstone of Hitler's governance. The Reichswehr, the German military, was initially reluctant to support Hitler's rise to power, fearing that his radical ideology and populist rhetoric could provoke foreign hostility. However, Hitler's political maneuvers and promises of military expansion won over key figures in the armed forces, culminating in their unwavering support for Hitler by the outbreak of World War II. The rearmament of Germany, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, was a central component of Hitler's strategy, as he sought to restore Germany's status as a dominant European power. The build-up of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine ensured that Germany would be a formidable military force, capable of executing the conquests that Hitler envisioned. The fusion of state and military power in Nazi Germany would later enable the regime's brutal conquests and the systematic extermination of millions during the Holocaust. Hitler's regime was not merely a political system. It was a deeply ideological movement that sought to reshape the very identity of the German people. Under his direction, education, media, and cultural institutions were brought under strict Nazi control, ensuring that every aspect of society reinforced the regime's values. The Gestapo and the SS maintained a pervasive surveillance state, monitoring and suppressing any form of dissent. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, became the enforcers of Hitler's racial policies, responsible for the imprisonment, torture, and extermination of those deemed enemies of the state. The Gestapo, the secret police, ensured that any opposition, whether political or social, was swiftly and ruthlessly eliminated. In this way, Hitler created a state in which absolute obedience was demanded, and any challenge to the regime was met with swift retribution. The enforcement of Hitler's policies left an indelible mark on the German population. Fear, propaganda, and the elimination of opposition created a culture of obedience in which individuals were either complicit in the regime's atrocities or remained silent to survive. The persecution of minorities, the suppression of dissent, and the militarization of society ensured that the Nazi regime would not be challenged from within. By the time Hitler initiated his aggressive expansionist policies and led Germany into war, the state was already a fully controlled entity, ensuring the implementation of his most brutal and fanatical goals. The legacy of a monstrous vision. Adolf Hitler's legacy is one of unparalleled devastation, a historical scar that will never fully heal. The sheer magnitude of destruction wrought by his regime, millions of lives extinguished, entire societies uprooted, and the collapse of political order has left an indelible mark on global history. The Holocaust, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, remains a grim testament to the horrors that can arise from unchecked ideological extremism. Hitler's vision of a racially pure Aryan state not only resulted in the deaths of millions but also reshaped international politics, altering the path of the 20th century and beyond. His influence extended far beyond his lifetime, as the consequences of his actions continue to inform legal, ethical, and political discourse today. The rise and fall of the Nazi regime fundamentally altered the political landscape of Europe and the world. Hitler's aggressive militarism and expansionist ambitions, embodied in the concept of Lebensraum, led directly to the outbreak of the Second World War, a conflict that reshaped the geopolitical order. The war not only decimated Germany but also left Europe in political and economic ruin, leading to the division of the continent along ideological lines during the Cold War. The Holocaust, in particular, became a catalyst for the evolution of international human rights law. The Nuremberg trials, held after the war, set a precedent for prosecuting individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity, establishing the legal foundations for future international tribunals. The horrors of the Holocaust also led to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, a direct response to the mass extermination of European Jews. The global trauma of Hitler's regime contributed to the creation of the United Nations, with the aim of preventing such atrocities from occurring again. The ideological underpinnings of the Nazi regime have also influenced political thought and discourse in unexpected ways. Hitler's manipulation of propaganda, the use of mass media to manipulate public sentiment, and the weaponization of nationalist rhetoric have since been studied and adapted by authoritarian figures and governments alike. His methods of propaganda, particularly the use of scapegoating and the cultivation of a charismatic, seemingly all-powerful leader, have been replicated in various political movements throughout the world. In the post-war era, elements of Nazi ideology, particularly antisemitism and racial superiority, have resurfaced in extremist movements, often in distorted or evolved forms. While Hitler himself was discredited and his regime defeated, the ideological framework that underpinned his rule continues to haunt global politics. Hitler's reign also left a profound psychological and societal impact on the German people. The process of coming to terms with the past has been a central part of post-war German identity. The country has undertaken extensive efforts to confront and condemn its Nazi past, including education programs, Holocaust memorials, and legal measures to prevent the resurgence of extremist ideologies. The legacy of the Holocaust remains a central focus in Germany, with regular commemorations and national remembrance days dedicated to those who perished under Nazi rule. Despite these efforts, the question of how such a catastrophe could occur within a modern, industrial state remains a subject of historical inquiry, reminding the world of the dangers of complacency in the face of rising extremism.